My parents promised they would simply check on my apartment while I worked overseas for 5 years, water the plants, collect the mail, and make sure everything stayed safe until I came home. The day I finally returned, my key no longer fit the front door. A complete stranger opened it instead, smiled politely, and said, "Can I help you?" That was the moment I realized someone had been living inside my home for years without me knowing. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 34 years old and work as a structural engineer. 5 years ago, I accepted the opportunity of a lifetime to help build a massive transportation project in Germany. The contract paid more money than I had ever imagined, but it also meant leaving my hometown and everyone I cared about for several years. Before leaving, I finally achieved something I had worked towards since my early 20s. I paid off every dollar of my apartment mortgage. Holding the final bank statement in my hands felt unreal. That apartment wasn't just property. It represented years of overtime, missed vacations, and countless sacrifices made so I could own something completely free of debt. My parents, Robert and Linda Carter, lived less than 40 minutes away. They were proud of everything I had accomplished and repeatedly insisted I shouldn't worry about the apartment while I was overseas. My father joked that he would make sure the pipes didn't freeze, while my mother promised she would keep the place exactly as I left it. A week before my flight, we sat together inside the apartment discussing every detail. I handed my father a spare set of keys and explained exactly where important documents, utility information, and emergency contacts were located. He smiled, shook my hand, and said, "When you come back, it'll feel like you never even left." The apartment contained everything I truly valued: family photo albums, childhood keepsakes, expensive tools, furniture I had saved years to buy, and boxes filled with engineering books. I wasn't worried about theft because I trusted my parents completely. If anyone asked me then who I trusted most in the world, I would have answered without hesitation: my family. Life in Germany moved faster than I expected. The project was enormous, involving hundreds of engineers from different countries. Long shifts became normal, but every paycheck reminded me why I accepted the offer. My dream wasn't just saving money. I planned to return home and open my own engineering consulting company before turning 40. During the first year, I called my parents almost every Sunday. They always gave the same reassuring updates. "Everything is perfect. The apartment looks exactly the same. We opened the windows today." Sometimes my mother even laughed and said the flowers on the balcony looked healthier than when I had been living there myself. Whenever I asked for photos, my parents happily sent them. The living room looked clean. The kitchen appeared untouched. My bedroom seemed exactly as I remembered it. I never noticed that every picture showed nearly identical angles. Years later, I would discover most of those photos had been taken before my plane ever left the United States. About 18 months into my contract, one of my neighbors, Mrs. Reynolds, sent me a short message through social media. She asked whether I had decided to rent out my apartment because she had seen unfamiliar people coming and going several times. Before I could answer, my father called and dismissed the entire situation. He explained that a plumber had been repairing a water leak affecting several apartments in the building. According to him, workers had entered my apartment multiple times during the week. The explanation sounded reasonable, and I apologized for questioning him. Looking back, I realized that was the first moment I ignored a warning simply because I trusted my family. As the years passed, my career flourished. I received promotions, performance bonuses, and contract extensions that significantly increased my income. Every extra dollar went directly into savings because I wanted complete financial freedom when I returned home. My apartment remained the foundation of that dream, waiting quietly for the day I finally came back. Around my third year overseas, my parents became strangely interested in whether I planned to stay in Germany permanently. They casually mentioned how expensive it was to keep an empty apartment and suggested selling it. I immediately refused. That apartment represented my future, and I had absolutely no intention of letting it go. My father quickly dropped the subject and apologized for bringing it up. He claimed he was only thinking about maintenance costs and property taxes. I believed him because nothing else had ever given me reason to doubt my parents. If anything, I felt guilty for assuming they might have another motive behind what seemed like innocent advice. 5 years passed faster than I ever imagined. My final project was complete, my savings account exceeded every goal I had set, and my return flight was finally booked. I decided not to tell anyone my exact arrival date because I wanted to surprise my parents. I never imagined the biggest surprise would be waiting behind the front door of my own apartment. I landed in Chicago on a rainy Tuesday morning carrying 2 suitcases and 5 years of plans. Instead of calling my parents, I rented a car and drove straight toward my apartment. I imagined unlocking the front door, opening the windows, and finally sleeping in my own bed again. The closer I got, the more excited I became. It felt like I was finally coming home. As I turned into the apartment complex, something immediately felt different. A black SUV occupied my assigned parking space. At first, I assumed someone had parked there by mistake. Then I noticed flower pots on my balcony that I had never purchased. Bright children's toys were scattered across the patio. None of them belonged to me. I walked upstairs carrying my luggage, trying to convince myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe my parents were cleaning. Maybe they were repainting the apartment. But when I reached my front door, my stomach tightened. The brass lock I had installed years earlier was gone. Someone had replaced it with a completely different electronic keypad. I pulled my old key from my pocket anyway. I already knew it wouldn't work, but I needed to try. The key slid halfway into the lock before stopping completely. I stared at the handle in disbelief. 5 years earlier, I had personally installed that deadbolt. Now it looked as though I had never lived there at all. Before I could knock, the door suddenly opened. A man in his early 40s stood there holding a grocery bag. Behind him, I saw unfamiliar furniture, children's shoes near the entrance, and framed family photographs hanging on walls that used to display pictures of my grandparents. For a moment, neither of us said a single word. Finally, the man smiled politely and asked, "Can I help you?" I looked past him into what had once been my living room before quietly replying, "Actually, I think this is my apartment." His smile disappeared immediately. He looked confused, then glanced over his shoulder as though expecting someone else to explain what was happening. He introduced himself as Mark Henderson and insisted he had been renting the apartment legally for almost 11 months. Thinking there had been some misunderstanding, he invited me inside and showed me a signed lease agreement. My heart nearly stopped when I looked at the signature on the last page. It belonged to my father, Robert Carter. Mark quickly realized I wasn't trying to scam him. He apologized repeatedly, explaining that he found the apartment through a local rental advertisement. He paid rent every month by bank transfer and had never missed a payment. Looking around the apartment, I understood he wasn't responsible for what had happened. He was another person who had trusted the wrong people. Trying to stay calm, I asked Mark whether he knew how long my father had been renting the apartment. He hesitated before answering. "The previous family lived here for nearly a year before we moved in. The property has been rented continuously as far as I know." My legs suddenly felt weak beneath me. I stepped into the hallway and immediately called my father. He answered cheerfully, asking whether Germany had finally become boring enough for me to visit home. I interrupted him before he could continue. "Dad, why is there another family living in my apartment?" The silence that followed lasted several seconds longer than any answer ever should have. When my father finally spoke, his voice sounded unusually calm. "Ethan, maybe we shouldn't discuss this over the phone." That sentence alone told me everything I needed to know. There wasn't a misunderstanding. He already knew exactly what I had discovered. I quietly answered, "I'm standing outside my apartment right now. Start talking." Instead of explaining, my father asked where I was and told me to wait. He promised he and my mother would arrive within 30 minutes. Before hanging up, he said one sentence I will never forget. "Your mother and I only did what we believed was best for the family." Hearing those words made my anger grow even stronger. While waiting, Mark offered me a cup of coffee and apologized again for unknowingly living in my apartment. We talked for nearly 20 minutes. He explained that my father always introduced himself as the owner and handled every repair personally. Nothing about the arrangement had ever seemed suspicious to him or his family. Exactly 35 minutes later, my parents pulled into the parking lot. My mother stepped out of the car already crying. My father looked tired but strangely prepared, as though he had rehearsed this conversation many times in his head. The moment he saw me, he quietly said, "Let's go somewhere private. There's a lot you don't know." I didn't move. Standing in front of the apartment that had once been mine, I looked directly at my father and asked one simple question. How many families have lived inside my home? He lowered his eyes for several seconds before answering so quietly I almost didn't hear him. You're not going to like the answer. My father took a deep breath before answering. Including Mark's family, 6. I stared at him, convinced I had misheard. 6 different families had lived inside my apartment while I believed it had been sitting empty for 5 years. My mother quietly wiped away tears but never denied what he said. That silence hurt almost as much as the confession itself. I asked the only question that mattered. Why? My father looked at the ground before saying the apartment had been empty and wasting money. According to him, renting it out seemed like the responsible decision. He insisted they planned to tell me eventually, but every year it became harder to admit what they had already done. I reminded him that I had never given permission to rent my property. He nodded slowly and admitted that was true. Then he tried to justify everything by saying they always kept the apartment clean and repaired between tenants. Hearing him describe my home like it was an investment property instead of my future made my blood boil. I asked where the rent money had gone. My parents exchanged nervous glances before my mother quietly answered, "We used it for family expenses." She refused to explain further. My father quickly interrupted, saying we should discuss finances somewhere private. The fact they avoided such a simple question told me the truth was far worse than I expected. Mark stepped outside after hearing our conversation. He apologized again and offered copies of every lease agreement, payment receipt, and message exchanged with my father. I thanked him sincerely. None of this was his fault. Without realizing it, he had become the first person willing to help me uncover exactly what my own parents had hidden for years. That evening, I checked into a nearby hotel instead of staying with my parents. I couldn't bring myself to sit at their dinner table pretending everything was normal. After unpacking my bags, I spread every document Mark had given me across the bed. The rental history stretched back almost to the exact month I had boarded my flight to Germany. The next morning, I carefully added every monthly payment listed in the lease agreements. Even before finishing the calculation, the total exceeded $100,000. My hands shook as I reached the final figure. Over 5 years, my parents had collected nearly $140,000 in rent from my apartment. I immediately scheduled a meeting with a real estate attorney named Sarah Mitchell. After reviewing the lease agreements, she looked at me and asked one question. Did you ever sign a property management contract or authorize your parents to rent the apartment? I answered no without hesitation. Her expression immediately became much more serious. Sarah explained that allowing someone to hold spare keys wasn't the same as giving them legal authority to lease a property. Unless I had signed specific documents, my parents had no right to collect rent in my name. She advised me not to confront them again until we gathered every piece of evidence available. Before leaving her office, Sarah gave me a checklist: bank records, tax documents, insurance information, utility bills, property taxes. Every record connected to the apartment could reveal how long the scheme had lasted and exactly where the rental income had gone. She believed the paperwork would tell a story even my parents couldn't deny. That afternoon, I requested copies of my property's utility history. The records immediately exposed another lie. Electricity, water, and internet usage had remained consistently high for almost 5 years. My parents had repeatedly told me they only visited once a week to check on the apartment. The bills proved someone had been living there the entire time. As I reviewed more records, another disturbing detail appeared. The mailing address for several apartment-related notices had quietly been changed from my overseas address to my parents' home. Every important letter about the property had been redirected without my knowledge, ensuring I would never receive complaints, inspection notices, or tax correspondence directly. When I called the post office to ask when the forwarding request had been submitted, the employee confirmed it had been filed only weeks after I left for Germany. My father had signed the authorization using paperwork that identified him as the person responsible for receiving all property-related mail during my absence. That evening, my mother called repeatedly, leaving emotional voicemail messages. She begged me not to involve lawyers because families solve problems together. I listened to every message but never answered. If they truly believed families solved problems together, they had chosen a very strange way of proving it during the previous 5 years. Just before midnight, Sarah emailed me after reviewing another document I had forwarded earlier that day. One sentence in her message made my stomach drop. "Ethan, I think your parents may have done more than simply rent your apartment. We need to meet first thing tomorrow morning." The next morning, Sarah spread several documents across her conference table before pointing to one highlighted section. During the 3rd year I was in Germany, my parents had signed a long-term property management agreement using my apartment's address. They weren't pretending to watch the property anymore. They had been operating it like a professional rental business. At first, I thought that agreement alone explained everything. Then Sarah noticed something even more troubling. The management contract listed my father as the authorized owner representative, but no document in the file gave him permission to sign on my behalf. Someone had simply assumed no one would ever question the paperwork. Sarah immediately requested certified copies from the county records office. She wanted to compare every signature connected to my apartment during the previous 5 years. If any document had been altered or signed without authority, it could completely change the legal direction of the case. For the first time, I realized this might become much bigger than a family dispute. Later that afternoon, Sarah called with another discovery. My parents had renewed the rental agreement several times without ever mentioning my name to tenants. Every lease identified my father as the person responsible for maintenance, inspections, rent collection, and emergency repairs. Anyone reading those contracts would naturally assume he owned the apartment. I couldn't stop wondering how my parents justified all of this to themselves. They hadn't hidden one mistake for 5 years. They had built an entire system around my apartment. Advertisements, lease agreements, inspections, repairs, and rent collection had become routine. It wasn't one bad decision anymore. It had become part of their everyday lives. Sarah advised me not to confront them until we understood where every dollar had gone. Money usually leaves a trail. If they deposited rent into personal accounts, paid bills, or purchased expensive items, those records would eventually appear. She believed financial evidence would reveal motives that conversations never could. 2 days later, my father unexpectedly appeared outside my hotel carrying a large folder. He quietly asked whether we could talk before lawyers made everything worse. I agreed to listen, but refused to promise anything else. Whatever explanation he planned to give, it couldn't erase 5 years of carefully hidden deception. Inside the folder were maintenance receipts, plumbing invoices, appliance repairs, and property tax payments. My father pointed proudly at every document, insisting they had spent thousands of dollars keeping the apartment in excellent condition. He seemed convinced those expenses somehow justified renting out property that never belonged to him. When I asked again where the remaining money had gone, my father became silent. My mother finally whispered that some of it helped my younger sister after her divorce. Then she admitted they had also paid medical bills, replaced their roof, and covered several family emergencies. They spoke as though my apartment had become the family's savings account. I reminded them that none of those decisions were theirs to make. Every dollar belonged to the apartment's owner, not the people holding spare keys. My father looked genuinely surprised by my anger. He quietly replied, "We always believed that when you came home we'd explain everything and work it out together." That answer hurt more than any apology could have. That night, I replayed every conversation I'd had with my parents over the past 5 years. Every time they told me the apartment was just fine, another family had actually been living there. Every photo they sent, every reassuring phone call, every promise had been carefully crafted to keep me from asking more questions. The betrayal wasn't only financial. It had been built on thousands of small lies repeated for years. The following morning, Sarah received copies of my parents' bank records through the discovery process. The rent payments matched every lease agreement Mark had provided. Month after month, tenants deposited money into my father's personal account. Not a single payment had ever been placed into an account under my name or held in trust for me. Sarah highlighted several unusually large withdrawals made shortly after each rent payment. Instead of saving the money, my parents spent it almost immediately. Luxury cruise reservations, furniture stores, vehicle payments, and expensive home renovations appeared throughout the statements. The apartment hadn't simply covered emergencies. It had quietly financed a lifestyle they otherwise couldn't afford. Then another transfer caught my attention. Every month, a fixed amount went to my younger sister, Emily. I loved my sister, but I had no idea she had been receiving money connected to my apartment. Sarah advised me not to assume Emily knew where it came from. The transfers alone didn't prove she understood what my parents had done. I arranged to meet Emily that weekend. The moment I explained why I had returned unexpectedly, she looked completely confused. When I asked whether our parents had been helping her financially, she admitted they sent money every month after her divorce. Then she quietly added something that changed everything. They told me it was coming from an investment Grandpa left for the family. Emily immediately started crying after hearing the truth. She insisted she believed our parents had been using money from an old investment account created by our grandfather years earlier. She had no idea a single dollar came from my apartment. The moment she realized what had happened, she offered to return every cent she had received, even if it meant starting over financially. A week later, we all met in a mediation room before the case reached trial. My parents finally admitted they had never expected the arrangement to last 5 years. They claimed each new tenant made it easier to continue because the extra income solved one financial problem after another. Eventually, they convinced themselves they were only borrowing the money until I returned. Sarah calmly presented every lease agreement, every bank transfer, every utility bill, and every forwarded piece of mail. There was no argument left to make. The documents showed a clear pattern stretching across 5 years. This wasn't a misunderstanding between family members. It was a deliberate decision repeated month after month while keeping the true owner completely unaware. Before the hearing ended, my father quietly apologized for the first time. He admitted the biggest mistake wasn't renting the apartment. It was choosing another lie every time I called from Germany asking whether everything was okay. Each conversation became harder than the last, but he never found the courage to tell me the truth. The judge ruled that every dollar of rental income belonged to me. Because my parents had already spent most of it, they were ordered to repay the remaining balance over time through a structured payment plan. The court also confirmed that every lease signed without my authorization had been legally invalid from the very beginning. Mark and his family were given enough time to find another apartment without being forced onto the street. I assured them personally that I had never blamed them for any of this. They had signed what appeared to be legitimate documents and paid every month's rent honestly. They were victims of the situation just as much as I was. Once the apartment became empty again, I unlocked the door with a brand new set of keys. The rooms looked familiar, but they no longer felt like home. Different paint covered the walls. My furniture had been rearranged countless times. Even the smell inside was different. It was strange standing in my own property feeling like a visitor. Over the next several weeks, I slowly rebuilt the apartment. I repainted every room, replaced damaged furniture, restored old family photographs, and unpacked the boxes I had carried home from Germany. Every small improvement reminded me that I wasn't rebuilding a property. I was rebuilding a place where I finally felt safe again. Emily continued apologizing even though I never blamed her. She eventually returned part of the money voluntarily after selling her second car. I told her the money mattered far less than her honesty. Unlike our parents, she admitted the truth the moment she learned it and accepted responsibility for fixing what she could. My relationship with my parents never fully returned to what it once was. We still spoke occasionally, but trust had disappeared. They often said they wished they could go back and make different choices. Unfortunately, some mistakes don't disappear simply because people finally admit they were wrong. About a year later, I finally opened the engineering consulting company I had dreamed about while working in Germany. The apartment became my first office. Every morning when I unlocked the front door, I remembered exactly how close I had come to losing everything I had spent years building. One afternoon, my father stopped by unexpectedly. He didn't ask for forgiveness or money. Instead, he quietly handed me the original spare key I had trusted him with 5 years earlier. "I don't deserve to keep this anymore," he said before walking away. It was the shortest conversation we had shared in months. I placed that old key inside my desk instead of throwing it away. It reminded me that trust is valuable because it takes years to build and only one decision to destroy. Every time I looked at it, I remembered not just what my parents had done, but how important clear boundaries are, even with the people you love most. Looking back, working overseas wasn't the biggest challenge of my life. Coming home was. I expected to return to the apartment I had left behind. Instead, I returned to a completely different reality where strangers had lived my life. My parents had made choices that were never theirs to make, and everything I believed had been tested. If this experience taught me anything, it's that trust should never replace communication or legal protection, even within a family. Love and good intentions don't give anyone ownership over another person's life or property. I eventually got my apartment back, but the greatest loss wasn't measured in money. It was realizing that the place I trusted most had become the place where trust was broken first.